Cocktails. It's your honest, no BS, non-salesy conversation about enterprise data management with tasty beverages in hand. I'm Tim Gasper, longtime data nerd, product guy, customer guy at Data.World, joined by Juan.
Hey, Tim, it's Wednesday. We're live here, middle of the week, end of your day, and it's time to take that break, have a nice drink, a cocktail, and let's go talk about data, metadata, knowledge, all that stuff. And today, today's one of these episodes where I'm like, finally, we're doing something that we should have been doing more before, which is we need to get comfortable being uncomfortable. We need to really bring in different, diverse points of views and from the data world, we need to just learn stuff that we're like not doing. And I am really, really excited about Amalia Child. So Amalia, we got connected with other folks through Jenna Johnson, I think. And she said, look, here's this person who's actually from the library sciences, combining data, and you got to go meet her. And she's writing this great article about stuff we'll get into. So Amalia Child, a data manager and librarian, because how many people in the world can say those two things? Welcome. How are you doing?
Thanks. I'm very well. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. So let's kick it off. What are we drinking and what are we toasting for?
Should I start?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I'm drinking a phony Negroni. I'm nothing if not an elder millennial. So Negronis are my drink, but it is a weekday. And yeah, it's all right. It's not as good as a real Negroni, but it's fine. It'll do the trick. And I would love to toast too. So I had two professors in library school who unfortunately have since passed since they were teaching me, but they had a huge impact on my career. And I would love to honor them. Jim Matarazzo was my special libraries professor. We can talk about what special libraries are if you like. And Michael Sullivan was my public libraries professor. And they've both definitely informed my approach throughout my career. So cheers to that.
Cheers to that. That's awesome when you go back to your academic settings and you're like, there's all these people a long time ago who have made an impact and you don't realize it. Then you realize it and like, yeah, these people will be there around for your entire life. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Tim, how about you? What are you drinking? What are you toasting here today?
I have made something up, which is I've taken a little bit of whiskey and I had like some hibiscus liqueur and a little bit of rosemary liqueur. And so I was like, I'm just going to see how this tastes. It tastes okay. It tastes all right. So I don't have a name for it yet. So audience members, please come up with something. But I just want to say cheers also to, I think that's great, Amalia. Like those who had it influence us in our academic settings, like especially for me, I had some high school teachers that were just incredibly impactful to me. I know one of them has passed away. So like just cheers to the amazing people that have an influence on us and get us going on this journey of learning.
So I have, so here's the story of this. This is an Americano Aperol spritz. So I've had a long day. I've had a lot of coffee and then it's 4:00 and I still have some of my coffee, like my third big pour or whatever. And I'm like, okay, I'll just do something with my coffee. And I'm like, well, Bailey's or whatever. I walk into my bar and then I'm like, there's Aperol. And then I'm like, let's look for coffee and Aperol. And I saw some cocktails like, let's go try that. Actually, this is pretty good.
Sounds pretty good. I don't know if I could take the caffeine at this hour, but
no, I'm Colombian, so I drink coffee all the time. But this is actually gets the sweetness. Like, I'm liking this one. So and then let's do that. Cheers to our professors. Cheers to our professors who have really made an impact in our lives. Cheers to that. So, talking about books and libraries, our warm-up question today is, what is your favorite book or your favorite author?
Right. You gave me time to prepare this and I completely forgot. But I think my default answer has to be Joan Didion as an author. I studied her in college. She's a novelist and essayist and screenwriter, famously from California. She's had a resurgence among some of the more stylish girlies these days. But I loved her essays in college and just she's known for style and tone and commentary, cultural commentary and politics. So, yeah.
How about you, Tim? For me, that's so tough. I'm gonna say I'm a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell, and so Blink was a really interesting book. I mean, all his work is very thought provoking, makes you think in new ways, and a lot of times there's a lot of data behind it. So yeah, I guess I'll say that.
And for me, one of the books I started reading as a kid, which I really enjoyed, is everything by Michael Crichton, the author of Jurassic Park and all that stuff. And I just really loved how I would read his books and I would imagine like a movie in my head, and then I'll actually go watch the movies because a lot of them are Jurassic Park, and then he has some cheese like Congo and stuff like that. But you would watch these movies and like it would match so much what I had in my head, and that was just so fascinating. So, and he has so many different movies that come out of his books. So I really enjoyed reading his books, and I have to go back to there's so many classics.
You big Jurassic Park fan?
Yeah, all the Jurassic Parks, and then like the Rising Sun. He started off being like an anonymous writer because he's a MD from Harvard, so he had like some medical stories back early on. So he has a very fascinating life. And so
interesting.
Yeah. All right, but talking about libraries and books, let's dive in. So you wrote a post a month ago called the 5 Laws of Data Enablement, how the father of library science would make his data team indispensable. Honest, no BS. What does that even mean?
Well, the title is a play on the 5 Laws of Library Science, which is a book that S.R. Ranganathan, who is known as the father of library science in some places and circles, wrote in 1931. And so I basically have adapted his book and his laws to modern data management. And I think his focus on emphasizing the use of books and data in this interpretation, I think Jenna Jordan actually gave me the title, led me to call it the 5 Laws of Data Enablement rather than something like the 5 Laws of Data Governance or 5 Laws of something data management. And so really wanted to lead with that enablement and thinking about kind of the tone of some conversations I was picking up on this year in data. I think since interest rates have risen and sort of Gen AI is coming in, I just felt a little like, and maybe it's just my bubble, but like a little deflation among some data folks, a little pessimism about what are we good for? What are we doing here? There's so much competition. Are we making ourselves obsolete? That sort of thing. And really wanted to bring some like grounding and optimism into the conversation if I could. That's what I got from the book anyway.
So before we go into the discussing all the there's 5 laws, like,
yeah,
let's I mean, we started kind of right before getting live, like telling us all the perception that, I mean, people are reading this and kind of the impact it was already having. So let's get people excited about, hey, if you haven't read this, go read it. But like, here's really look at the impact it's already having.
Sure. Yeah, so I think one of the reasons I wrote it is that I introduce myself sometimes as a librarian in the data community, on and off, and I get a lot of reactions that are sort of like Dewey Decimal System or just a little bit like simplistic about librarianship. And there's a lot of complexity that goes into librarianship and library science that I wanted to also surface to the data community and these parallels between the two fields. And so yeah, I think the opens with some historical context and kind of trying to identify some of those parallels, and then has these 5 laws that I think some folks, it sounds like, have shared at meetings with their teams or sent along to their colleagues in different departments. And yeah, folks' reactions have been great. I think my favorite reaction probably came from the institute that Ranganathan founded in Bangalore. Someone named Janavi found me on LinkedIn and told me that she was really excited to read it. She had worked in data and is now studying library and information science there, and had just celebrated his birthday with her classmates and everybody, and was just like excited to see his legacy, you know, in the US living on. So that was one of my favorite.
Cool.
Yeah, it's really neat. It was a really great note.
That's fascinating. You should be very proud of yourself. So let's dive in.
Yeah.
So let's go through these. Tell us about law number 1.
Well, should I start a little bit just with the framing at all?
Actually, yes, please. Sorry. Yeah,
and that feeds into the law number 1.
Yeah, of course.
Books are for use. And so, you know, in 1931, Ranganathan he had been a math professor who was kind of a reluctant accidental librarian and fell into it. I'll make the long story short, got really excited about librarianship and studied it kind of across the globe, but especially in England, and was learning about contemporary library practices. He was reluctant in part because the library that he had his first job at was pretty boring. Nobody was coming in, nobody was using the books. There was just like not a lot going on. And so he was putting this in context, thinking about how, you know, back to medieval times, books were like chained to the shelves, and librarians were tasked mostly with protecting texts that were hard to reproduce and like could get ruined by people touching them, protecting those from everyone other than like specialists and scholars. But as democracy rose around the world and printing technology changed, you know, by the early 20th century, there was a paradigm shift in the attitude that we should like boost literacy and open up access to books, and people will become better entertained, but also, better educated and more literate, and that will have economic returns and social returns, and it'll be a great investment, basically. And so there were a lot of angles on that. And that changes how you architect your libraries, how you program your libraries, how you collect, which books you collect, and then how you organize them so that people can come get them, and then allowing people to actually touch them and bring them home. And so as I was reading through kind of that history and framing of the book, obviously I just saw a lot of parallels in the shift in data management over the past few decades. That happened over centuries, where data became cheaper to store and process, and there are new sort of modes of access, and we got on this sort of data democratization kick and self-service analytics and all of that. And so it just, all these parallels were just,
you're like, well, I see these things, they
reverberating. Yeah. And then as I dug into the laws, and we can talk about them and all his anecdotes, there just kept being more and more analogs that were just fun to find and identify. So the first law is that books are for use. And so I go into all that framing because you kind of, it's obvious, and he sees it as obvious, but it wasn't obvious at the time. Now that's how we think of libraries. And so if that's the case, and if data are for use and we want to get it into people's hands and enable people to use it, how does that change the design of our program and the way we staff our teams? What are sort of the ergonomics? So he was thinking about like locating your library centrally instead of up on a hill where it's pretty. You locate it where people can actually get to it, and you open it during hours that make sense when they're not at work, or all hours of the day, basically, that people are awake is what he says it should be. You add comfy furniture, maybe you add a little garden, so people actually want to go and be there and sit down and read a book. And then you staff it with people who are going to be welcoming and enthusiastic and like ready to help and curious about, if you come up to someone at a reference desk and ask, you can ask kind of anything, basically. Theoretically, it's information related, but it's a public service. So you can ask anything, and the librarian needs to be ready to kind of receive that and peel back the layers of what you're really asking and contextualize, like, are you a 5-year-old asking about birds, or are you like a professional bird watcher? I don't know if that exists, but like you're going to need different books depending on that background. And so you want to have people who are both technically savvy and educated, scholarly, and can get to know the collection and have the skills to organize it. But you also want people who are just interested in people and making sure that they are served with the information that they need. And so, that's basically the first law. And so the reference interview is a concept that, just to mention Jenna once more, has a post about kind of expanding on the reference interview and requirements gathering and data. But that's like a process that librarians have aligned on that is meant to convey that empathy and support and sticking with the problem until you can find a solution, whether it's like a book in the collection or some other information solution that's going to get them what they need.
So I love this first law, this first parallel here. Obviously, it ties so well to, this movement that we're seeing all throughout the sort of data landscape now around data democratization, around self-service analytics and self-service data consumption, right? This idea that, wait a second, how can we open data up for other people to be leveraging? It seems like in obviously the library kind of world, right? Like the problems have been mostly solved around, hey, how do we let somebody borrow it? But what if they don't bring it back? Oh, well,
Right.
they'll be fine. And, like there's a system that makes sure that the bad things get taken care of, right? But seems like in data, we're still working through some of those things, but the goal is true, right? Like if you want people to use data to make an impact, to make a difference, to do their jobs better, then you have to let them have it, and you have to find a way to let them have it.
Yeah. And I do want to emphasize, like, I completely understand that there are legal and ethical obligations that we need to fulfill. Like that, it's not sort of, and I'm careful to say what we call governance, because I think you can define governance in a lot of different ways, but what we call governance around security and quality, like there are standards that we want and need to meet. But beyond that, when you have an option of saying like, yeah, I'll work with you in Excel, instead of making you sort of conform to what I think this data flow should look like, maybe that's your best option on this first pass so that you can build trust and they'll come back. You're not alienating them and removing them from the tool they're most comfortable in, unless you see like a real business risk to using Excel for that use case. Just stick with Excel, solve that problem there, and then you have a chance of them coming back and following your process next time when it's a more appropriate solution. That kind of thing is the kind of choice I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things you brought up was these reference interviews and requirements gathering. Can you dive into that? Because I think this is something that in from the library science is like, this is well-trodden territory.
Yeah.
And now we're talking about data product managers and
Right.
in a way, maybe reinventing the wheel. So tell
Yeah.
us about the existing wheels.
Yeah, and no shade to product management. I think they can be complementary, and there are elements of that process that I think are very analogous. And I think, I'm not an expert product manager. I've seen guidance for requirements gathering. I think the reference interview really emphasizes that trust building and relationship building and empathy piece in a way that I just haven't seen in a ton of the material about product management. Maybe I'm just missing some material. And there are certainly technical aspects to the reference interview, guidelines as well, in terms of what the steps are for how to do research together. And that might, echo a lot of what's in the product management requirements gathering guidance. But I think what I see is that emphasis on the skill set around making sure they understand you're paying attention to them, you're a priority, and sort of following through and finding a path to a solution, even if you and your team aren't going to be the ones who are going to provide it. So you see a lot of libraries offering resources that point people in other directions, even if it's not the library itself. And I think some people quibble with the idea of a data team as kind of a connector, but I think that we can be unusually situated to be a connector across the organization, since we have our eyes on so many different data consumers and producers, that that is one way that we can provide solutions without adding actually to our workload.
I think that what you're opening up is this connection part, right? It's like, if we understand, our goal is to really understand what is your true pain, and we have all like the data, the books, the library, all that stuff. I can really point you to the right direction if I truly if I understand what you're trying to go do. Therefore, let's go really understand that, because if otherwise you're just like, I need this, I'm like, you got to ask the why behind the why behind the why. Otherwise, you're like just passing people data that you don't even know that's what you really need. What is the problem you're trying to go solve? Because if you told me, I can tell you that's not really what you need. You need these other stuff and these other people connected to that stuff. So,
and I think the other piece of it is, that sort of getting to know your customer, patron, stakeholder, whatever you want to call it, over time, or just knowing your organization, so that like, did they just come from a really high pressure meeting where someone got reamed out and that's part of the urgency? Or, if we develop this metric together and it shows that they or their team aren't performing the way that they expect, is that some anxiety that they're bringing to this organization? That's a lot of the other stuff that goes into the reference interview, where you're thinking about their sort of insecurities or external influences that could be changing the nature of the conversation. Like, there's some sensitivity of data that we don't really always talk about, where it doesn't always show a rosy picture, and so people don't want to look at it. But in order to make progress, we actually need to be rigorous and do it anyway, right? But there's a lot of emotion tied up in that.
Tim, this is just a reminder of like the what episode, I forget who it was, Ergist. He's like a recommendation, like he was like, we were talking recommendations for data engineers. He's like, we need to be more empathetic. And I think another topic we always had here is like the data therapy, having these therapy sessions. It kind of feels a lot like that.
Yeah, I agree with that. So let's move to the second law. So like, what's the second law of library meets data?
Yeah, so the second law sort of is one of the other ones that Ranganathan really emphasizes. The last three are sort of shorter chapters, but it really doubles down on the idea that when he says they're for use by everybody, I mean everybody. And he was pretty progressive for the time. He's talking about women and people of every class and all of that. And so, the way I interpreted that was that a lot of the time, I think data teams focus on the analysts and the data scientists, and we can talk about what the definition of a data team is. Here, I'm really talking about kind of that data management central function, people who are sort of thinking about strategy and the end-to-end life cycle, and not sort of individual pieces of the flow. So we often think about analysts and data scientists as our core users, or at least I have. And this is really trying to say, no, we mean everybody. And that also means that everybody has a role to play in kind of the data management process and the data use process. So he says at some point, you don't just dump a bunch of books into the middle of a room and like let everybody have at it. Like that's the piece that's a mix of enablement and governance. So I like or a lot of people seem to respond to the idea of the little free library, which do you have little free libraries in your neighborhoods? Have you seen those?
Yeah, we have one in my neighborhood. Yeah, it looks like you do, Juan.
Yep.
Okay. Does it resonate with you that it's not the best books in the neighborhood in that little box? So if people don't know them,
Yeah.
these are sort of cabinets, or sometimes they look like big birdhouses. They're lovely in their intent. And I like seeing them around my neighborhood, and they're usually sitting on like a fence post in somebody's lawn, and they're meant for it's like a leave a penny, take a penny kind of thing, except with books. So you can put books in and you can take books out. Obviously it's free, and usually somebody, sponsors it in their yard. But, they're not taking an active hand in curating the collection. They're not soliciting interesting books from their neighbors. It's just sort of a free for all. And if you asked people to pay for it, I don't think anyone would. Whereas, when libraries in your city that are sort of well run and beloved are threatened with budget cuts, people will come out, even if they're not library users themselves, because they see their community and its needs reflected in the library, whether that's the school kids or the older folks needing, computer help or access, that kind of thing. And so, this is basically the argument that it takes some administration and investment to get the most out of data. You can't just open up access and expect to get a ton of value. And so he advocates for a federated approach. This idea is really designed for public libraries, but I think a lot of folks tend to adopt or drift to the hub and spoke model, where you have a central library or a central team that is going to use and manage infrastructure or shared resources efficiently. And then what he has as branch libraries, but you might have kind of like domain teams sitting closer to areas of the business and specializing a bit more in those specific requirements. And then among the stakeholders, you kind of have the obligation to treat these shared resources as shared. And so their interaction with these shared resources, these data sets and tools, can have impacts on the organization and on their colleagues. And so they just need to recognize you're there to enable them and not to inconvenience them. And those policies, in theory, are there for a reason. But they have to understand those risks and those benefits to themselves and each other to, I think, be incentivized to sort of go along with whatever policies you've set up and best practices and those sort of things.
This is kind of blowing my mind a little bit, because I'm sure Juan can see my expressions. We've done enough of these episodes now, where I'm like, oh crap, libraries have been doing data mesh for decades.
Oh, okay, Tim, you got.
We think we're so clever. We're like, oh, data mesh. We're like, oh shit, we're 40 years too late.
40 years too late. 400 years too late.
400 years too late.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it. Libraries have been doing data mesh for centuries.
That's funny. Yeah.
No, this is awesome. I mean, it's exactly right. It's like there's, if it's a small town, right, you might just have one library, right? But as the city gets bigger, you might have a centralized library, and then you have branch libraries, and they need to fit together into a system. And you're not going to have the exact same books in every single kind of library, and you've got different specializations, right, that start to form. You get librarians and administrators and different structures in terms of people to govern all that information. And why do you have governance? The purpose of that governance is not to take people's books away from them. It's to put the system in place that allows you to give the books to everyone.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I like to think a lot about libraries in vacation towns, in part because I have two nieces that I'm obsessed with. And now that we go on vacation, we use the libraries for that. I go to libraries almost everywhere on vacation, because you can charge your phone and sit in an armchair and pick up a book that you left at home and just keep reading it and that sort of thing. But yeah, with the kids, we tend to go in sort of vacation destinations, and thinking about the way that sort of those types of towns organize their resources sort of seasonally, or and programming and allocating their budgets, just because there are kind of competing interests in terms of the locals and the visitors, and the fact that most visitors don't pay into the library, but you still want to support them again seasonally. That's just sort of one interesting example of that. Yeah. And that's another piece of this law, is that the community or the organization needs to have a sense of its vision and its identity and its goals for your data team to respond to, right? It's really hard as a data team to prioritize if the company doesn't have its priorities organized. And same for any library, right? If the town doesn't really know who it is or what it is, it's hard to program for. Yeah. Or if you don't have data on your town, for example, librarians are very strategic and data driven and use a lot of statistics to inform their decisions about this stuff.
What's an example of of a vision that like a library system might have, which would allow them to kind of rally around some clarity?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think in libraries tend to have a few different governing bodies, right? And so you have the administration in the city, and then also like a board of trustees and that sort of thing. So you take input from the community and as well as kind of the administrators. But yeah, a vacation town feels like one of those where you tourism is probably part of your town's identity. And so you want that to be reflected in various services. But you also have, you know, a population throughout the year. This is a terrible answer. Let me think about this.
No,
I actually like it. I wasn't sure where you were going to go, but I like
that makes sense. I mean, it's like, I mean, going back to the analogy is like, we have to understand with organizations is like, what is your identity? Like, what are your objectives? What are the values that you are trying to put out there? And I mean, and that's really going to inform like where you're going to go invest more. Like, we need more data stuff in here versus this other thing and so forth. Right? Are we really customer centric? Are we really customer driven? Right? This thing? Are we really about like operational costs so low? We're trying to be so lean, right? So I'm like, I mean.
And how do you connect it to your identity, right? Because like if your vision is democratize data, it's like, okay, well, that's good. Like, I mean, that's good. You want to do that, right? But it's not specific to your identity, right?
That's like saying, yeah, we need to have a library. Like, yeah.
For what?
No, I get it. But we're a vacation town. There's a lot of tourists. Well, if we're gonna have libraries, I think we're gonna get a lot of the books around there are gonna be things about things that you can do here, right? And there's gonna be more of those books versus
beach reads, fun reads, right? Yeah.
And then on the flip side, I think you probably have some like more cities that are known for an entrepreneurial spirit, and they may have more of like a workspace, you know, type of thing, and different types of like a business center or technology center, that type of thing. And so you see, if you look closely, you'll see a lot of libraries sort of adapting their collections to their populations that way. Or if you have a ton of kids or not a ton of kids, you know.
Right. Yeah. Kids, you might have more kid centers and things like that in the library. If it's a more entrepreneurial spirit, you might have more spaces where people can go into a closed room and there's people can get some work done collaboratively in small groups and things like that. Like it's even more than just the books. It's also the spaces that these and the experiences that these libraries are creating.
Exactly. To translate this back is like, what is the experience that you're providing then for within your organization for people to go use the data, right? Is your organization very technical? You're a software company, right? You build software, so the majority of people in your organizations are very, very technical. It's going to be a very different experience than if you're not one, right? The people you don't do technical stuff, right? I mean, just thinking. I mean. Not non-salesy stuff, but like we can publicly say that like one of our customers is Indeed, for example. Indeed is a highly technical company. Even the CEO like goes in and writes code and stuff like, so they have a completely different experience of like some of the other customers are like, no, we just want to have a marketplace experience stuff. Like I think that this is really resonates. Really, this is about understanding who your community is, and there's like no one size fits all.
Right. Yeah.
All right, I love these.
Third law.
Keep going because
yeah. So third law is the flip side of the second law. So every stakeholder, their data set. Third law is every data set, its stakeholder, right? So the first component of this is really leaning into sort of education, marketing, and outreach. And a lot of librarians, you know, in school environments and academic librarians are actually sort of instructors or certified as teachers, as well as being librarians. So leaning into sort of education, marketing, and outreach practices in order to make sure that the folks who aren't sort of naturally just going to jump at the chance to have access and follow that path all the way down to whatever technical whatever use cases you intend for them to use, like especially if you're pivoting from more of a restricted access, governance focused paradigm, you know, over decades or months, to a more access based orientation. Not everybody is going to know what they can get from the data or how to work with your team. And so this is a chance to use sort of onboarding sessions or documentation or just like a sort of more intuitive architecture in order to make the data more accessible to the folks who aren't sort of naturally inclined. And so, or like already aware, whether from a previous organization or a previous role of how to work with you. And I think some of the folks who are naturally inclined can give us a false sense of confidence that what we've built and what we're providing is intuitive and wonderful. And we think of them as our champions, and they're amazing. And I think they can also be like a point of access to the folks who don't feel that way. But yeah, this I think I'm a big believer in sort of level setting sessions to onboard folks, and just make sure everyone kind of has a point of entry. Who is this team? What do they do? What are they for? How do I contact them? Basics. And then from there, you can get into sort of more advanced stuff, and data catalogs and enriching metadata and making that available is one mechanism, and so on. Yeah.
So the way I'm interpreting this is like we have all these books, we have all this data, and then we really need to be able to kind of educate the community out there. It's like, here's what we have, and here are the opportunities, and not just expect like, oh, we know that they're going to build it and they will come, right?
Yeah. So
there will be some folks who will build it and they will come, but we have to be careful saying, oh, those are their champions, because there's maybe some other people who can really take advantage of that, who are going to be very diverse kind of backgrounds on this. But we're not paying attention to them. We're not going out. We're not outreaching them. That can actually kind of change the perspectives of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, we are the sort of data experts. And so there are probably cases where we understand that a certain data set could be really useful to a certain team. Can we make that connection for them? There's something in librarianship called reader advisory, which is a little different from reference, where somebody comes to you saying, like, can you recommend something? Here's something else I liked, for example, or here's who I am. And I think there's an opportunity, you don't want to sell anything people don't need, but there's an opportunity to do some of that matchmaking from the vantage point of being the expert in the data and understanding the data that's available with those teams who might not sort of intuit automatically that might be useful to them in their decision making. And then the flip side is that if you've tried to provide data sets, tools, newsletters, services, whatever it is, and nobody's coming, like, cancel office hours, let it go. Weed, I mean, should make a good effort, but weed the data sets. We call it weeding in librarianship. Archive, put them on ice, things that nobody is using. It's expensive, and it sort of clutters things up in a way that makes things harder to navigate for a lot of users, I think.
This was actually kind of the question I was going to ask you, is like, well, what happens to the books that people aren't reading? Or, you said weeding, right? I think in data management, we think of like sort of data lifecycle management, right? And like, it's time to archive, it's time to delete it, right? We don't need that table. This is all part of the process.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think librarians and archivists have this reputation for like being hoarders that I think is a misconception from maybe previous times. Even archivists are very strategic about what they acquire and what they keep, and they have a process for deaccessioning based on some rubric of like, what's valuable, what do we need to keep for posterity? Okay, the auditors are going to come, we have to keep that data set, we can't get rid of it. But other things like, sort of the Marie Kondo approach is overplayed, but like, thank it for its service and let it go. There's a reason you walk into libraries and they don't have every book they've ever collected. They have a physical space. It's a real constraint and a budget constraint that they're working with. So there's a whole process for decommissioning books and weeding books. And I used to be on the board of the Friends of the Library in a city near here, and we ran the book sales, and that was part of some of the sort of inputs to the book sales were decommissioned library books, and you'd see the jacket with the call number and everything. And then other ones were donated by the community. And so those would get resold for like $1 a pop. And then there's a whole sort of waste management process from there. They go through all the different stages of trying to get sold, and then eventually.
That's fascinating. This is the part of libraries that I have no idea about.
The underbelly, it's like happening in the basement. Yeah.
What happens to the forgotten books? Now, one other related question to this is like, and you mentioned it a little bit, is this like, is a curation aspect, right? And like, you go to the library and you see things like that table in front that says like, hot reads for, a cool day or something, like there's like these curated kind of things. I mean, that's sort of a, sensational example, but sometimes it's topical. Sometimes it's genre oriented, right? Sometimes, it can be different things. Is curation part of this kind of law and this story, or is it kind of part of something else?
Yeah, I would say so. That sort of promotion and marketing, that certainly falls under the third law, those displays. And I would say, in my research role, often we would come across things just in the course of research, and you'd say, I know this team or that person was looking at this last week. Like, I just found this interesting thing that just came out. I didn't have access to it when they were asking for it. I'm going to send it along proactively. And it takes a little maturity and familiarity with the organization and with people to like do that, because when you get something like that and it doesn't hit the mark, you're kind of like, okay, now I have to respond to it. But when it hits the mark, you're like, oh, they were thinking about me. They understood what I was interested in and what might be helpful to me. And I think it really just demonstrates that feeling of being like plugged in with your organization, and means a lot to stakeholders when you do that, I think, when you get it right. And so it does take a little bit of, I think, professional maturity and like institutional knowledge to get to that point. But yeah, that's sort of that proactive outreach.
All right.
Oh, and sorry, the other piece of this, and we can move on, but is one of my favorite parts was in the book, Ranganathan mentions as like a lure to get people into like more serious literature and boost data literacy, was to create these like comfortable rooms close to the entrance for like periodicals, magazines, and newspapers, because that's what people were going to read like regularly, and it was easy to read. And so that's how you get them in. And so I think of that as like, give them a data set that's fun to work with, or that they really can see themselves and their team in. If you're doing a demo or something like that, like give them something that's going to resonate and feels easy to engage with versus like your most impressive and challenging data product. It seems like he was trying not to be snobby about magazines, but he sounded kind of snobby about magazines.
These ones don't count as much.
Yeah, I can't say enough about how weird and funny this book is.
So,
all right, law 4.
Yeah, what's the fourth law?
Yeah, also pretty intuitive. Save the time of the stakeholder or the reader. Originally, if nothing else, they'll go around us if we don't deliver data solutions pretty quickly. And so this is really, I think it's pretty intuitive to people that people need things quickly, and they're going to see more value out of data if they get it, quickly by the time they need it. And so he highlights 3 mechanisms that I've translated, or not mechanisms, strategies that I've translated loosely to, building self-service tools. So you see in libraries, like, so I think of wayfinding and signage as a self-service tool. That's how you navigate the Dewey Decimal System yourself, or the Library of Congress system or whatever. If you don't know kind of call numbers by heart, you'll see a lot of like color coding, and sometimes just the very architecture of the building will help you kind of make your way through the system. Self-service, self-checkout kiosks, just like at CVS. The Libby app, I don't know if you've used that, but it's a great app that was developed, I think, in collaboration with librarians, that will give you access to ebooks and audiobooks that your library network holds. So I use it a ton, just on your cell phone. Things like that. So you could just sort of self-serve and never interact with the librarian. And that saves the time of the librarians as well, right? Like, they don't have to serve every one of those requests. And so I think there are a lot of applications for that in data. We think about self-serve analytics, data products, all of that falls under that bucket. But I also have experienced quite often as a data consumer and librarian, that if you're really engaging with data, it's not that hard to hit the limits of a self-service tool. Like, sometimes if you're really digging into stuff, you might need to differentiate whatever your analysis from the definition that was set for you in whatever that user interface is. And so making the data team or the librarians available for when people hit the boundaries of those self-service tools, I think is needed in many cases. And obviously we all deal with like burnout and overload in that context, but so you have to manage that volume sometimes, but just making yourselves available and so people know how to find you. And then the third is meeting people where they are and embedding, analysts or solutions in processes and workflows and tools that already exist, or teams that already exist. And I like the example there of the bookmobile, which we can talk about if you'd like.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know how much you know about bookmobiles. They used to be like horse-drawn wagons. So they go way back, and they've changed form. Now they're more like minibuses usually. And they can be used to deliver materials that have been requested by a community that can't make its way to the library for mobility or distance or time reasons. And so that's kind of like, on request delivery. But often they're also used to sort of curate a collection based on whatever the community at the destination might be interested in, again, using some data about what they might be interested in. And then sometimes come with programming. And that gives you a point, once you get there, it gives you a point of access to folks who don't necessarily walk into the library and tell you what they need. And so you're getting a better understanding of your community and hearing from people just by being out in that part of your city or whatever. And then all along the way, if you have your logo on the bookmobile, it's sort of a marketing tool for everybody to get a visual reminder of the library who might not pass by it, by their branch every day. And so it serves like many different functions, which is why I like it.
I'm thinking about the analogy of like how you would do this. What is the equivalent of the bookmobile, meeting people where they are in organizations? It's like really like doing these workshops or stuff, like going there and like, you won't come to our data catalog, our marketplace, and like, well, let's go do some workshops with different kind of parts of the org to understand. Or we've talked to a few people. Let me go show you some stuff that we have, but your colleagues are interested in, and we want to hear from you. So,
yeah.
Oh,
I think about it a lot as like also just breaking out of not every team is like this, but if you have some rigidity about the stack that you work with, I think of it often as breaking out of that. So the example I used earlier of just solutioning with someone in Excel, if that's what they're working in and it works fine for their use case, but they need some help with data and data expertise, like that's what you bring to that situation. And it gives you that point of access into, okay, this is how they're solving that problem. Maybe in the future, that's something we can build it. We can put it on our backlog and build it out differently, but you're not alienating them. You're meeting them where they are at the moment. Again, if there's no great business risk in handling that in Excel, work with them there. Or, we all complain about Salesforce. I just saw someone the other day kind of making this point. So I'm building on it, if you will. But we all complain about Salesforce and Salesforce objects with like 500 columns or whatever. We're the data experts. We're too far downstream often of the process of like building things out in these operational systems. Is there an opportunity for us to partner with people rather than having to clean it up in the warehouse, 6 months later? Is there an opportunity for us to be part of those conversations instead? And I think some teams are doing that, but this is just an example of a rationale.
Yeah, it starts to go beyond the metaphor a little bit, but it starts to make you think like, how can we streamline this? How can we make this system better? How can we ultimately result in time savings for individuals and the organization? And that may require that we move up and down sort of the the stack here, left and right, to people that are upstream, to people that are downstream. Another thing that crossed my mind when we're talking about the bookmobiles is there's an aspect to this which we're solving through humans, right? Where we say, hey, here's a data analyst, and they're coming to the marketing department and saying like, hey, look, I know you guys are struggling with the X and Y problem. Like, here's a couple of data sets that might be useful to you. And, here I created a couple of reports already that I think you might be able to leverage. And you're kind of bringing that curated collection to them in your analyst mobile and trying to help them out.
Yeah. And to the degree that there's capacity, I think also like folks will send analysts to different meetings, and that just saves the time of like explaining what happened in the meeting and getting that recap. Like you want to save the time of the data team where you can as well. And I completely recognize that issue as well. But so you have to obviously use a mix of tools in the kit and find the appropriate moments for this stuff.
You can't have thousands of bookmobiles per city. That doesn't work.
Yeah.
All right, we got the last one.
So the last one is that basically if you follow these 4 laws, your data function or your library will grow, both in terms of like the size and the number of books or data sets that you're managing, your team, your tools and services over time, as well as in the sort of, it'll change and grow in the form that it takes. And so, I think we see over the decades evolutions in tech and circumstances and priorities for any given data team and for the industry as a whole. And so I think that's both exciting and optimistic for a lot of data leaders, and also really daunting to sort of have to renegotiate your boundaries and your scope when new technology emerges or when new needs arise. I think it's a good problem to have, a better problem to have certainly than nobody engaging with the data. I at moments where I feel sort of overwhelmed or daunted by that idea, I do think it's helpful to come back to sort of some of these grounding principles and like think about what you're here to do and celebrate incremental wins and on some level like touch grass and think about what is the business trying to do, and not worry so much about like whether you're keeping up with the latest data tech.
This for me, it's like if you're if the no if you're being successful if your work just got freaking more complicated.
Right. Yeah. And change is constant. My boss at the investment firm used to say that all the time, and that's hard, but it's that's what growth feels like, I think. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. This resonates. This connects. Like, I'm just like my day to day, just talking to customers and prospects and just leaders and friends and everybody in space. Like everything you just said is just so connected with what I'm hearing every day. And I know, and it's just, there's just so many. Once we're having this conversation, it's like, oh, this is kind of obvious. This is kind of like, but we need to make these connections. And they're like, well, if I was looking at it from that perspective, it makes sense. I mean, the simplest thing is like, oh, libraries, if you're in this bigger place, you have a central library, you have branches. Like, we all talk about what's a centralized place or decentralized. Like, we've been doing this type of stuff forever. And like, just look at the stuff that in your own city, your own town. Like, just look at that. Right? Go to the branch in your one library and go to another library, and it'll probably be different. Just try to understand those things. Like, the stuff is like so much right in front of us that we
I know.
make it so freaking complicated when it's not. It shouldn't be.
I know, but yeah, I think so many professions feel sort of oversimplified or misunderstood from outside, and libraries are no exception, but they're also not alone in that, or librarians. And so I think, yeah, it's easy to oversimplify from outside, but they're very similar in my experience, this layer at least of the two things. And I've started to think about it a little bit. It's not quite right to left. I feel like it's a stack all along. It's sort of like the computer science, data science, information science, and library science layers of all of these problems. And yeah, anyway, I don't know.
No, I love it. I love the parallels between these two universes. And honestly, they're not parallel universes. They're overlapped. They're highly integrated with each other, which I think is an important thing to remember. Just before we kind of go to our lightning round here, we talked about the sort of the library analogy and obviously these 5 rules, which are awesome. And folks should go check out your blog post to learn more and read up more on this. Library science specifically, right? Is there anything from library science, which is sort of outside of these 5 laws, that we should be taking more to heart when we think about our data?
Oh, that's a great question. That you might have stumped me. Let me think.
I just think there's all these skill sets, across a lot of different disciplines, but certainly library science is one of those where these arts are sometimes thought through a pretty niche lens, but they shouldn't be, right? Yeah. Like, I'll pick something a little too technical, I think, but like classifications and schemes around classification, right? We think like, oh, wow, that's so specific. It's like, well, isn't like kind of everything that we're trying to do around curation and around, identifying things, isn't it all a classification problem? Like, why aren't there more people that understand the best practices of classification instead of just making it up? Like, there's way too much making it up when it comes to these types of things going on in the industry right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. And I feel like things like sort of taxonomies and tags and data catalogs are underutilized. So that's a great one. And I think I've landed as well on sort of information literacy. And we talk a lot about data literacy, and I sometimes sort of tease them, and I did in the essay, into sort of numeracy and information literacy. I'm not in the weeds of that conversation, but there are folks who specialize in information literacy and in library and information science in particular. Laura Saunders at Simmons, where I went to school, is a specialist in that, and could be interesting as a guest. Not to spoil I have a different recommendation for your last question. So that's another area where it feels like both, let's not reinvent the wheel. Not that we are. I think there are data literacy specialists who probably have a lot to add to this conversation too, but I would love to see a little more collapsing of the distinction between data sources and information sources, I think, might be what I would say. Like we didn't, as a research team, we did a lot of work in data, but we didn't sort of distinguish between qualitative and quantitative research in that environment. The way that once I joined a data team, it sort of, it felt like sometimes it fell off our radar to think about all of the different information flows that were happening alongside the data.
Yeah. I don't think that data organizations really, I mean, like people will say that they understand, but I don't know that they really understand some of these different levels of the layer cake that you're talking about, kind of like data, information, like there's these layers, and I don't know. I feel like everyone tends to kind of muddle them together in the data space. So like, I like your distinction here around like the data, like data versus information.
Yeah, I think in practice, a lot of people are dabbling across that spectrum and just might not have plugged it into a framework for themselves,
Yeah.
right? Like people are working in information who are working in data. If that makes sense.
Agreed.
There's so much to read, so much stuff to go learn about this.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We got to go do. Let's do our lightning round.
Yeah.
All right, I got it. Number one, do we need library scientists on our data teams?
I think, or is it lightning round? Yeah, why not? Consider it. Consider how they might plug in. Yeah.
Love it. Second lightning round question. Where do you feel, this is actually going to be an open-ended one.
Okay.
Where do you feel is the biggest disconnect between the library analogy and data?
The analogy, I think probably when you start thinking about data products and data teams as producers, librarians are researchers often and might consider themselves producers in some ways. But I think that is probably the area that I've struggled most to sort of complete the overlap. And I think, again, they're complementary, but that's probably...
The people writing the books live in the library.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Something like that. Yeah. And like, yeah, I think often of like analysts as sort of journalists working sources and directing attention and getting scoops and things like that. And yeah, that doesn't feel as much like, yeah. And data scientists sort of have a different profile. So as insofar as they are data producers, I think of that as a distinct thing. But I also think, you know, data scientists and analysts often wear that data manager hat and function as librarians in some ways too. Yeah.
All right, next question. Can we think of knowledge and data in the same way?
In the same way? How do you mean?
Well, I think it's the way let's say the way we manage data and the way we manage knowledge. Are those, can we do this in the same way, or like very different approaches and different tools and technologies and approaches and systems and processes and people?
So, okay, I'm going to spoil my second recommendation for who to talk to next. I think data management is sort of like a form of knowledge management. That's sort of how I see it. Stan Garfield, I think, would be a fun guest on this show. I don't know if you know him, but he's a leader in the knowledge management field. And I would love his take on like how to enrich a data catalog and get, you know, adoption and engagement with metadata and all of that. So that'll be my cop-out answer.
This is an interesting statement to me. I know we're out of time to unpack it today, but data management is a form of knowledge management. Like I want to unpack that at some point.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll think about it some more and we can catch up another time.
We have this book. It's on my read. Making Knowledge Management Clickable by Hilger and Waltz. Joe Hilger was on our guest before, but there's so much knowledge management. I
think when you're defining concepts and modeling the data to represent those concepts, it feels like you're capturing knowledge at that point and then gathering information about, you know, it just.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's some strong
knowledge management has been too relegated to this idea of like, you know, unstructured and CMSs and you know, things like that, you know?
Yeah.
But anyways, we digress. All right. Final lightning round question. in the data world, right, we've got like things like stewards, owners, curators, ambassadors, subject matter experts, therapists, right? Yeah, whatever, right? We got these different roles. Does library science inform something about which of these roles are the right ones?
That's a good question. Sorry.
No,
You're fine. You're fine.
Which roles are the right ones?
Maybe the answer is no. I don't know.
I think I just need to think about it some more. That's a complicated question.
No, that's fair.
Yeah, I'm gonna take that one. I'll find you on LinkedIn or something.
All right. No, that's fine. It's
That's true.
interesting question.
Yeah.
All right,
There's
Tim.
so much disparity across the landscape as the like, what do we call our data roles, right?
I know. I think the thing I'll say that's been sort of reverberating in my head this summer is that it feels sometimes like the librarian role integrates a number of different like hats or roles that data teams have specialized in a way, like particularly around sort of data management versus governance and analytics, I think. So yeah, I'll take that one to sleep on.
No, that's fair. It's possible that the data librarian is an underappreciated role term.
Yeah.
All right, Tim, take us away with your takeaways.
We took so many notes.
Listeners,
I'm always impressed by your
listeners. We're screwed. We're screwed. We took too many notes. We're too excited. We got too excited here. All right, I'll do my best. So takeaways. You started with talking about Raghunathan and what he wrote, right, around being this sort of reluctant librarian and trying to change the perspective around how we build libraries and how they actually have value for organization, well, for the world, right, for the communities that they serve and for the world. And you kind of contrasted like medieval times, right? The books were chained to the shelves. Now you got the printing press, you've got democratization of books. The price of a book is coming way down. You can have lots of copies of books. Books were becoming democratized, right? And communities wanted to boost literacy. They wanted to improve the access to the books. They wanted to provide education and economic returns and social returns. And sound familiar? We want to do some similar stuff like that around our data and knowledge within our organizations. And so he wrote about these 5 laws, which you expertly adapted in your post to the world of data. And the first one is books are for use, right? The point of these books is for it to be used, which, wasn't obvious at the time, right? It's obvious now that books are for use. Data is for use. Mostly obvious, not always obvious, more for some organizations than others, right? But isn't the goal to take data and empower the organization with that data and knowledge? And the answer should be yes. And you provided this kind of analogy around the library where, the library is there to provide books to the community. There are certain decisions you make to improve the access to books. For example, you don't put it on the high hill far from town just because it looks pretty, right? You put it in the center of town and you make sure that it's got, a nice big door and it looks welcoming and it's got places to sit and ways to enjoy and be social, right? So this is all part of that democratized experience around books, around data, right? We talked about reference interviews, and really the phrase I wrote down was get to know your data patrons. Really get to know the folks that want to leverage this data, and that's going to help you learn. Emphasis on trust, emphasis on empathy. You mentioned, obviously, you have to meet legal and ethical standards. So that's an important part around data. But, where you have to meet those things, meet people where they are. For example, if they want to be in Excel, find a way to collaborate around Excel. Law 2 was sort of the flip side of that, right? Where, if the first one is data for everyone, it's, law two is everybody to their data set, right? This is really thinking about how these different personas, they exist, right? You're not just going to dump all the books in the center of the room or have these free use libraries that hang out on the corner of the street. There's a fit for purpose aspect of what you're trying to do around data and around how you're curating and managing the library. And we talked about how this scales and how you scale this sort of specialization. It's this hub and spoke model, right? And as you scale, you have to have sort of the central library and the branches, and there's specializations that happen. And some books you want to have shared across organizations, and some you want to be specialized. And crap, we've been doing data meshes for over 400 years, and we think this is so novel. So, it's just cool to see these parallels. I think it helps us to learn and borrow what works and what has been established, and also appreciate where some of the differences are. Oh, so many other things I could say, but Juan, what are your takeaways?
Right, so let's go. Law number 3: every book its reader, right? Every data set its stakeholder, which means that we need to really have that education, that marketing, and the outreach. Not everyone is going to know what is out there to get that data. There will be the folks that you may think about it, build them, they will come, and that does apply to the folks who are like, oh, I need this, they can go run to it. But there's also probably people who have no idea about that. And you need to be able to go reach out to them so you can understand who they are. And everyone has a point of entry. We need to be able to kind of onboard folks. But at the same time, like, hey, if you're doing all this stuff and having office hours, and nobody's coming, just cancel them. Like we have to go through that whole life science, that life cycle, the weeding, right? It's time to archive it. It's just part of the process. And there's this misconception: librarians, archivists, they're not hoarders. They're actually being very strategic. There's some things that you do need to keep track of. Auditors will come, and then you'll need to have that balance of, does this bring me joy, or thank you for your service, right? We should also be very proactive with the community, the stakeholders. I mean, hey, I'm reaching back to you because I know that you're interested in this, and I found this is maybe of your interest. And we want to get them in. Just like the analogy of the libraries is, like, at the entrance, you have all these newspapers and the stuff that we're going to be read day to day. Like, get them in with that fun, easy data stuff that resonates with them. And then the fourth law is save the time to the stakeholder and reader. So people need things quickly. That's why we want to have a lot of self-service and the self-checkouts and innovative signs and color coding. People can understand this, right? Ebooks with content network for fast digital access. So I think that's one of the things that we want to make it easy and make it fast, but also know that with self-service, we will hit a limit. So once you hit that limit, you want to be able to have access to those data teams, those librarians who will help you when you go hit that limit. And saving time is also about meeting people where they're at. And I think the analogy with the bookmobiles is like, you want to be able to deliver materials to folks who have requested it, curate a collection for a community, give access to folks who don't go to the library. And it's also it's a marketing term. So the analogy here too is like, hey, somebody is like doing something with data and they're doing it in their Excel approach. Well, meet them where they are, go solution with them in Excel and understand what they're doing and how they're doing that. Maybe that's something that you can go apply and improve on your library side, on your central side, or wherever, be able to go help them back later on. So don't alienate them. And then finally, the fifth law is, if you follow those first 4 laws, your library data function will grow. This is exciting, but it's going to be daunting. So it means basically price of success. So you need to know how to negotiate your boundaries, your scope, but better than no one engaging with all that data. Then finally, kind of close out with saying, hey, what else should we be taking about library sciences? And there's the whole area about like classifications, taxonomies. It's all about information literacy. I need to dive more into that. Like this difference between data sources and information sources, and kind of what is quantitative and qualitative. And, I mean, I think we're just barely scratching the surface here of what we've discussed. How did we do? Anything we missed?
No, sounds good.
All right. Well, you already told us who you want to invite next. What's your advice, and what resources do you follow?
Okay, 2 pieces of advice. One came from this exercise, which is like, read the whole book. It's never served me wrong to just actually go read the whole book and do that homework. And a lot of like historical and technical books tend to be, I'm sorry, the light in my house is shifting. Historical and technical books tend to be more entertaining and have like more personality than you'd expect. And this is one example of those. And then my other piece of advice is more life advice. And all my friends, if they listen to this, will laugh at me, but try weightlifting if you haven't already. I'm doing it to prevent osteoporosis, honestly. But it's been really awesome.
Try weightlifting?
Yeah. if you haven't already.
That's where I'm late. I need to go to my gym right now to go do that.
And then resources. I want to plug Locally Optimistic. I appreciate them having hosted my essay, and I also think they have a pretty great evergreen collection of career development and leadership type of posts, as well as
Really
like
great content there.
workflow posts. Great stuff, and great editors. And then as for weightlifting resources, I use the RISE program and can't recommend it enough. But so I'm an evangelist for it.
Fantastic. Well, Amalia, thank you so much. This has been eye-opening, and hope everybody who's been listening here we're blowing people's mind. Thank you so much.
I
really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Cheers, everybody.